it really is great to be here and amongst a group of people that you can say, well, you're my people. You're my people spiritually, but also professionally and vocationally. We all have a heart for making ideas connect with audiences. And in particular, I'm assuming that you want to try and get Christian ideas into secular marketplaces. So background for my context, so you know where I'm coming from. I started off in music radio, where it was all about, doing the perfect 40-second link between song 3 and song 4. And if you could do something really compelling in 40 seconds, I kid you not, it is actually a very difficult task. The shorter you go, the more tight you have to be. But if you can do that well, then actually you can transfer that skill to other arenas too. Moved on from music radio, we started a syndicated talk show called Open House, and this was out of Sydney. One of the reasons why Sydney was home for me is that a long-held dream became true. We had dreamt of this program for 10 years, and it was syndicated on 2 Christian stations in Australia between Sydney and Melbourne, 2 very large capital city stations, then moved to about 8 other cities. In the end, we had 100,000 listeners on a Sunday night. About half of them weren't Christians. The whole idea of the Open House program was that we would talk about life, faith, and culture from a Christian perspective. And we were trying to reach the secular but not religious Australian mind. That was our calling for that. I learnt so much from the Open House show. The 4 commitments that I came up with for us doing that show are really what I'm going to give you this morning as to what you might be able to then do in your own context. Since then, coming to the UK in 2011, been doing a lot of media, a lot of broadcast media in secular spaces, so BBC, CBC Canada, ABC in Australia, Radio 4 on the BBC, and in particular, BBC Radio 2. Radio 2 is the largest secular radio network in Europe, 14 million listeners on a given week. 8 million of those are listening to this woman here, Zoe Ball, in her breakfast show. 8 million. Now, the interesting thing about Radio 2, because of the historic Christendom in the UK, there is a little God spot on the nation's biggest breakfast radio show. It's called Pause for Thought. If any of you have a UK background, you might know Radio 4 has a very historic spot called Thought for the Day. Originally, it used to be the minister coming in and giving a little homily. These days, it's multi-faith. Well, Radio 2's version of that is kind of a more street-level version, of which people from a variety of faiths come in and give a little inspirational spot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring these 4 principles that we kind of developed in the Open House show, but then I apply to Radio 2, just my own application to Radio 2, because this is a thoroughly secular place. Walking into the station, I feel the pressures of secularism the moment I walk through the door. Sitting in the green room, ready to go on air, well, you're there with members of Spandau Ballet, they're about to go on before you. Or I got talking to the music director for Kylie Minogue, having a great conversation about how he comes up with the whole shows that she does. Well, she's on air, and then I'm going to come in after her and talk about Jesus. Sometimes it can feel a little bit like, foolishness to the Greeks. It can feel like, wow, what's going on here? But that's the opportunity that it is. So, 4 commitments that I hope you will be able to then take and use in your own context. Commitment number 1, we will be missional. That word's become pretty cool now. We were using it 11 years ago. In fact, we were using it 15 years ago. We were cool before everybody else was cool. That's all I can say. We'll be missional means 2 things. Number 1, it's not about us, it's about them. So we start with the audience. The scriptural basis for this, of course, is 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul says, to the Jew, I became a Jew. And to the Gentile, I became a Gentile. I did everything that I could to become like these people that I'm trying to reach in order to reach some. And then we have him doing that masterfully in the book of Acts. You think about Acts 13, where he's preaching to the Jews of Antioch. How does he frame that whole gospel message? He starts with their own idea, history, longings. He talks about the Davidic line. He talks about the longing for a Messiah. He talks about Jesus as fulfilling that Davidic longing and expectation for a Messiah in the line of David. And then he says, this is the one I'm proclaiming to you. Then you go to Acts 17 and see him proclaiming the gospel to the Greeks of Athens. Literally, I came in from Athens last night. I've had a week in Athens. I feel so Hellenized. I've been able to walk around the Agora where Paul was preaching, where Paul was trying to reach out to the people in the Agora, the marketplace, and where he was probably engaging with the Jews who were in a little synagogue just at the base of one of the temples there. And it's amazing to walk around. Anybody else been to Athens and done that? Right. It's amazing to walk in that space. But what does he do there? His whole sermon is completely different. He doesn't talk about the Davidic line, Jewish expectations of Messiah. He starts talking about the God who made all things. He starts quoting pagan poets whose original words were talking about Zeus. Now, if ever there was a challenge for potential syncretism, I don't know what else is, but he took that risk and started talking about we being his offspring. And he talked about, in him we live and move and have our being, and used it as a basis to then talk about one day there's going to be a judgment, and the person who's going to judge us is Jesus, and God has fulfilled that by raising him from the dead. He gets to the resurrection, he gets to Christianity, but he does that with the ideas and the thoughts and the longings that are already in the culture. This is what we were trying to do with the Open House Show. So the whole idea was Paul started with culture, and then he moved to Scripture. Now, we as good evangelicals have been taught for decades to actually do exactly the opposite. We start from Scripture and then move to culture. Now, in terms of preaching to the Jews of Antioch, that's what you do. But in doing this, we have to get a little bit more creative and, dare I say, risky. So we do that. We start with culture, move to Scripture, and we start building a bridge between the two, just like Paul did. So with the Open House Show, we talked about our audience's love of music, the books they were reading, like Eat, Pray, Love. And we were bringing out what are the longings, why is this book being so successful at this moment? We would talk about their films they were watching. We're talking about the longings that all of these things were exposing. Why were certain things particularly popular? Why was it that memoir was starting to have a huge resurgence in a particular time, say late 2000s, early kind of 2010s? Well, some theorists actually think that when life gets really hectic, really tough, really difficult, we long for memoir because it takes us into somebody else's story who has survived and actually learnt and grown through such a difficult time. Because that said something about the era. So we used those opportunities. By speaking to the Greeks of Athens, I was able to also get the Jews of Antioch. If I spoke in Christianese, I got my Christians, I got my 50% Christian audience, but I didn't get these people. And so our 50-50 would have been much more like 10-90. But speaking to the Greeks, if you will, I was able to then get the Jews. So that's been my modus operandi. How can you say it, Sheridan, in a way that doesn't employ the standard Christian lingo that you are so used to using with all the people that you live and work and have your being with? So that's the whole idea. Now, when it comes to the Pause for Thought spot on Radio 2, I try to employ the same kinds of techniques and the same kinds of ideas. You start with, just like Paul, recognizing that you will not be on the same page with your audience. So a thoroughly secular people, I can't go in and say certain things because they're not going to be on the same page. And I've been working with some wonderful producers through Radio 2, and they have never tried to stop me from being explicit about my faith. But what they have done is said, a secular audience has no interest in what you're talking about, Sheridan. Has no interest. Start from somewhere else. Or, we were given the topic of angels once. They said, well, just keep in mind, even though we've given you this topic, that to assume that the audience will be with you, that there is such a literal thing as an angel, is going to be a step too far. How are you going to do it in such a way that you can communicate in that way? Do you see what I mean? These are the barriers. Assume that they're not on the same page with you. You've got to get creative. Then we had to avoid all forms of preachiness. And that is a phrase that the producers continually come back to. This bit sounds preachy. The way it works, by the way, is you do a script. It's about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes, somewhere around 380 words. And then that goes to one set of producers, and then it goes to a final set of producers. Just to make sure it's okay that it's going to fit into the show, I have had scripts pulled the night before I'm about to go to air the next morning. And I've spent a day and a half on these scripts because something in the news has happened, and suddenly that message is going to be heard in a very different light. So it's pretty tough when you're then suddenly writing a script at 10 o'clock at night that you then have to get up at 3:30 in the morning to get into the car to then go down to London to then be ready by 5:45 to go on air and speak for 2 minutes, and then walk outside, make your way back to Oxford. So that's the nature of it. And you don't get paid extra for that, by the way, either. You're offering discoveries, you're not giving directions. So you're inviting people. Here's what I've learnt. I wonder if this could work for you as well. They avoid all sorts of rhetorical questions. You can ask a question occasionally, but it's not there. They don't want you to kind of be sounding like you're trying to push the listener into a corner. You speak conversationally. You want to be invitational rather than directional. But the second point to this, of course, is it's not just about them, it's about him. The BBC producers do not care a hoot whether I am theologically correct or not. They do not care at all whether I am being faithful to the biblical witness. But I care because of him. It's not just about them, it's about him. And this actually starts to get really tricky when we go into Paul's quoting of poets speaking about the wonders of Zeus, because it can be very easy to slip into syncretism. Syncretism will always be a temptation in this way. Always be. But this is where the edge is. This is where the risk is. I always think of Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 2, where he says, it wasn't with wise and persuasive words that I came preaching the gospel to you, but also with anybody remember? Demonstration of the Spirit's power. So you can't say that Paul wasn't wise and winsome. He was. Read the book of Romans. Read the book of Philemon. Scholars tell us the whole book of Philemon is based on Greek persuasion principles. He was a man of wisdom, but he also came with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. It has to be the Holy Spirit's work. Jesus said to seek first the kingdom first, not being clever with your communication, Sheridan. It's all got to be about him as well. So for Open House, that meant that inspiration and entertainment and analysis wasn't the end goal for us. We prayed every single Sunday night that the voice of God would be heard. And for Radio 2, it means resisting that subtle pressure to secularize, resisting the subtle pressure to baptize the culture with a little bit of Christian lingo on it. And it's very easy to do, and I've heard it done and have been tempted to do it myself. I'm looking for theological integrity. I want to be faithful within the format restrictions of a bright, engaging breakfast radio show that is not going to be a natural place to talk about death and sin and those kinds of things. You need to connect in with a secular audience where they are at and in that particular format. So faithfulness within the format. A question for you to then take to the person sitting next to you. I'm interested to know what tactics you use to keep in touch. How do you keep in touch with your secular audience around you? What do you use? Is it particular websites? Is it particular shows? Is it particular output of some kind? Particular authors, commentators? What else? What could it be? How do you keep in touch with your audience's interests, hopes, fears, and longings, all of which are wonderful seedbeds for connecting this kind of communication in? Okay, commitment number 2 is we will be credible. We will be credible. There is a number of ways to build credibility. It takes time. It can be lost overnight. So treat it as a precious resource. You can build it through excellence. If you consistently are doing excellent work, you can build up a name as a credible source, either you individually or you as your media brand. For Open House, this meant that we aimed to make every show better than last week's show. And it was the great credit. If people were to say to us, Open House is as good as anything we would hear on the ABC, that was a great credit to us because we were working with a fraction of the resources and a fraction of the people. But that's what we were aiming to do. For Pause for Thought, this means really attending to craft, really attending to good writing, good metaphor creation. As a writer, I find metaphors the most difficult thing because it's so easy to slip into cliche. and use the old hackneyed metaphors. The first metaphor that comes to mind, discard it, because it's probably there because it's been used 2,000 times before. But to come up with a really good fresh metaphor that gets under the skin, that takes time, for me anyway, and one that actually works. But a metaphor, what is it? It's a little poem in miniature, it's a little story in miniature. It helps to connect what people already know with something you're trying to lead them to. It takes time. And being strong yet conversational with your delivery. So constant improvement, growing in your craft, and consistently growing in that craft. Getting as possibly better as you can. And that for me actually is going and seeking outside opinion too. I'll actually send people clips and say, tell me where this goes right and tell me where I can improve. Second way is through expertise. I learned this the hard way. I remember we once had a guest on the open house show who had a good story about, and she was an author, she'd written her story up into a book, and she had been recommended to us as somebody that I should have on air and open up for phone calls for listeners to call in and ask her questions. The first bit was right, the second bit was the bad mistake, because in the end, it turned out that she only had her story. She didn't have actually the depth of research and experience and expertise that was required to actually deal with a whole bunch of other people's stories who weren't the same. And that was not her fault. She had written her story into a book. We had opened up the lines for phone calls, and I learned that night, okay, you never do that again. Because people were calling in, and the best she could kind of do was, oh, you go, girl, God's with you type thing, which was lovely. But it wasn't. I was listening to the voices on air, and they were walking away, not having been helped. That was my fault. So we will get the best people on air to talk about a topic, even if they're not Christians. So if it's talking about refugees, and the best person to talk about that, we'll get the best person from a secular university or whatever to talk, because they are the best person on that. Because we want to actually we are the authority at that point. We want to give them the best quality information that's possible. And for pause for thought, this means kind of getting the facts right, just authoritative sources and getting my facts right, which sometimes is half of a day just clarifying one particular figure, because 8 million people are listening, including the people who may have written the report that I'm referencing, and I don't want to get the figures wrong. And then through fairness, we were able to build a lot of credibility with the open house show in particular by actually getting our critics on air. And so whether it be the hardline atheists like Dan Barker, who's the founder of the Freedom for Religion Project in America, getting him on. No, we'd have him on in a debate setting, but we'd have him on. There was a secular journalist now named Caroline Simon, and she had done a very big report into megachurches and exposing, all the evils of megachurches. And so we actually got her on to then ask some kind of clarifying questions. Well, did you look at this? Did you look at that? And there were some things that we just simply had to say, mea culpa, right. As the Christian church, we need to listen to what you've just said, what you've brought to us. But have you actually thought about this second point, whether there's another way to explore that? Now, if we had just thrown the stones, or just written up our little reports, denouncing, we wouldn't build the credibility, and we wouldn't be able to actually engage with the important things she might have been bringing. And for the pause for thought spot, it's acknowledging the other side of faith. So the angels one, again, just recognizing that not everybody's going to believe that angels are real. Or one that producers often pull me up on when it comes to answered prayer. They always will want to know, yeah, but what about when prayer doesn't get answered? And so to acknowledge that. And this is where your own personal story can be so disarming. My wife and I tried for 10 years to have a family. We were unsuccessful. Now, out of that, God has actually brought very powerful ministry in ways that we were never expecting, and lives being changed as a result of that failure. I can then go on air and say, my wife and I prayed for 10 years and we never got what we wanted. I don't understand how this guy is prayed for and gets a miraculous healing or gets supernatural provision at this time, and we didn't. I don't understand how it works, but I'm not going to let this discount this, because this still happened. So actually it can turn out to be a powerful thing, because then people can see that Christians go through difficult times and sometimes it's not all wonderful. Now, I'm not too sure if this audio is going to work. It does work. Okay. If it's the right one. Okay. Let me play you a clip of what I'm talking about for the Pause for Thought spot. So this was one I was trying to do based on nature. A bit of research had just come out of one of England's universities saying that reflecting on nature, contemplating nature for as little as 20 seconds a day can actually bring incredible personal benefits. Decreases depression and anxiety, increases your sense of happiness, even increases your interest in looking after the environment, 20 seconds a day. Now I thought, here's a wonderful story that I might be able to connect with Romans 1:20. Before the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his divine nature and power have been seen in what has been made. To suggest that, could it be, we don't know, could it be that one of the things that we're getting from that is just we're glimpsing something beyond it? That's where I was trying to go with that. There were some challenges with doing that. Number one is that the research was based on the biophilia hypothesis, and it's kind of an evolutionary hypothesis that, we connect with nature because ultimately we are nature, we're from it, etc., etc. Number two was getting the facts right and getting the figures right, but also getting them in a communicable form for a mainstream audience, not a technical audience. 87% of the population believe this. Is it appropriate for me to then say the majority of the population? Just to give some shorthand. Have to wrestle with those things. And the third was the theological one, is that it was very easy then for me to stray into monism or pantheism to suggest that, somehow the nature itself is God. Right? So those were the kind of the challenges that I did, that I had to face. Here's the script. You've actually got it in Word form in your downloads as well, but here's how it went.
We mustn't panic. Let's try not to panic, everybody.
Wash your hands twice.
Okay, yes, keep your hands washed and elbow bump instead of shaking hands. What are you sharing with us today then, Sheridan?
I had a really interesting experience with a friend of mine who came out from Australia to visit last year, and as soon as Jason arrived, I wasted no time in showing him the best of Oxfordshire where I live. So I took him to Blenheim Palace, and I took him to the Bodleian Library. I took him to cosy villages with thatched roofed cottages to prove that such things really do exist outside of the midsummer moons. Visits to York and Holy Island came next, and then some hiking around Northumberland. One afternoon, we hiked up a windswept hill, crossed a field of wildflowers, then entered a forest of towering pines. The forest was quiet. Every crunch of our steps was heard against a whisper of rustling leaves. After the woods came a valley, and it's there that we stopped and paused for a minute. Clouds floated softly above us. A stream trickled nearby. The only sounds we heard then were bird songs. We stood there in silence for a full 15 minutes, just taking it all in. It turns out that what Jason and I were experiencing in that moment was something far more than just a pleasant diversion. According to research released last week from the University of Derby, people who stop to notice nature experience higher levels of happiness, lower levels of anxiety and depression, and a heightened desire to actually care for the earth. And as little as 20 seconds of contemplation a day is all it takes. Just as little as 20 seconds. Although walking through the forest is not enough. You have to watch the clouds, you have to smell the flowers, listen to the birds. The key isn't to be in nature, it's to notice it. Now, the interesting thing is, scientists are continuing to discuss why noticing nature like this affects us in this way. I wonder if there's a spiritual component to it. In the biblical story, God tells Job to contemplate the sea, sky, and stars as evidence of his presence. It's an experience that leaves Job speechless. Jesus said that watching the birds of the air and flowers of the field could reveal not just God's presence, but his care. Many thinkers and artists throughout history have believed that something greater lies beyond nature, like Van Gogh, whose vibrant sunflowers and swirling skies were trying to depict the light of God he saw shining through them. According to the researchers then, only a quarter of us stop to watch clouds or smell the wildflowers. And if they're right, taking a moment to notice nature will help both us and the planet. And if Job and Van Gogh are to be believed, it might also give us a glimpse of a God who notices us.
Thank you, sir. That's a day's writing for 3 minutes, let alone all the reflection beforehand to try and get that done. But you want to land on that final sentence because that's what people are going to take away. Maybe it gives you a glimpse of the God who notices us. Something that they can take away. Listening back in front of you and recognizing that for some of you, English is not your first language, I hear myself rushing and I'm just wondering whether you got the message. because it was a bit rushed, which is why I gave the text as well. But I'm glad that, at least for some, it's connected. I heard a great news director of a radio station say to her reporters, when you go out and report on a fire, I want to smell the smoke. I thought, that's it. That's good storytelling. When a radio person listening can smell the smoke and that's the thing. We could talk about storytelling at another time, but details, dialogue, delayed resolution are your three key aspects of telling a story so that you can actually feel it. All right, commitment number 3, we will be holistic. And by holistic, I mean let's touch on the whole gospel, not on pet topics. We have, in Australia and in the UK, we have had to battle quite a lot with ideas about Christian radio that have been imported, largely from America, of the ranty right-winger who really has only 3 things to talk about, which are?
Abortion, marriage.
Gay marriage, guns probably, something like that. We have wrestled with that, and it's been even worse the last few years. So to do this properly, we did not talk about abortion for 2 years. We had to build the credibility before we even went anywhere near that topic, because it was expected, as soon as we went to air with the Open House show, that we would be probably following suit. So we have had to wrestle with that. Now, just let me also say, some of the best media ever been done in this world has been done from our American brothers and sisters. So thank you all, because it is wonderful, thoughtful, creative, engaging stuff. But unfortunately, the loudest voices sometimes actually carry far beyond one country and into others. And we've wrestled with that a lot. We can't use the word evangelical. It's completely solid now. The whole gospel, not pet topic. So we wanted to actually get to a point where we could indeed be living out, His will be done on earth, just as it is in heaven. His will done in everything on earth, not just in these 3 areas, but in everything in earth. When it comes to in the environment, and when it comes to refugees, and when it comes to art, all of these wonderful things, the beauty of the earth, tackling all of these things, that is what gave people some degree of, hopefully, a winsome witness as to what our faith was all about. The gospel includes both the personal aspects of transformation and the societal aspects of transformation. Jesus, in Luke 4, of course, in his mission statement, he brings good news to the poor, freedom for prisoners, sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed. He proclaims the year of the Lord's favor, which is economics. So all of those things are actually there as part of the gospel. Now, the gospel at its heart is the atonement. It's making us connected back with God and us then connected back with each other. That is the heart. Then it actually affects everything else. And we found that by touching on that everything else bit, that people actually saw something beyond and were surprised by what they heard. So this all goes back to those wonderful 3 themes of creation, fall, and redemption. And when we can actually give a sense of the beauty and the horror of the world through those 3 filters, the Christian faith actually gives some really winsome answers to why you're feeling the horror that you're feeling with the Ukrainian war, and why you're feeling that wonderful sense of awe when you're in the presence of a wonderful sunset. So for Open House, this meant we dealt with Indigenous health issues, not just simply matters of religious freedom. We dealt with both. It meant that we never talked about the latest evangelism resource, because that was talking to the Jews of Antioch. It meant that we gave stories of people's lives being transformed. We gave a holistic gospel as much as we possibly could. We will be hospitable. This is our posture. This is our tone of voice. We did this 3 ways. We will have a posture of civility. We will aim as much as we possibly can to be doing all things with gentleness and respect. 1 Peter 3. And even if the antagonism comes our way, we will do our best, praying with the Holy Spirit's power in us, that we will respond with gentleness and respect. We would take a posture of listening. It was an amazing win for us when we would have people from all sorts of very different walks of life who would be listening to the show and would call in. And then, because they found a listening ear, they would then go and tell in front of 100,000 other people. Sometimes they were confessing to adultery that they'd never confessed to before. They were confessing to all sorts of lifestyle issues. sometimes for the first time. And this was happening simply because we were providing a listening ear to people. Now, sometimes they use pseudonyms, that's fine, but it was a real person with a real story. There is something powerful about listening to people. It gives an opportunity for that bridge to be built into the heart. And we would take a posture of invitation. Again, it wasn't so much about this is what you have to believe, and if you don't believe it, you're going to hell. This is Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead, and he's now transforming lives and changing the world. Will you like to be part of that? At least find out a little bit about that, and to invite them into that. Is there a place for talking about hell? Yes, there is. Especially when you have it made into the news. If it comes into the news somehow, even in a controversial way, bam, there's your opportunity. Get in there. But this is the approach we're taking. Again, we're approaching this from Acts 17. So we would do that in as many ways as we possibly could. And we would be just mindful of land grabs, something that the BBC producers pulled me up. I once had a line in one of my scripts for the Pause for Thought spot about a Buddhist who, when his plane started going down, found himself, surprise to him, praying. And praying not just to God in general, but praying to Jesus. And so I use this story as an opportunity that sometimes even those of us who may think that we don't believe in God, you might find yourself surprised at your own response. You might be praying sometimes. They didn't like that bit because they felt it was a land grab, that it was kind of claiming this one to come over into our territory, the Buddhist becoming a Christian. And because it's a multi-faith spot, they would be, concerned about those kinds of things. Okay, that's fine. It was an illustration. I could then change it. I did. But it gave me an insight into how people sometimes hear those kinds of stories that, at least in my case, it could almost be sounded like, oh yeah, you've been given the mic and now you've got 8 million people listening and now you're going to say why this religion is wrong and yours is right. So be mindful of that. Doesn't mean you don't talk about conversion stories from other religions, but just be mindful of that. All right, let's wrap up. One more spot.
So, what are we discussing this morning, Sheridan?
The theme this week on Pause for Thought is finding God in unexpected places. I'm really looking forward to hearing what everybody comes up with because it's a fascinating topic. For me, it got me thinking about a woman that my wife and I met a few years ago named Ali. Ali started visiting our Friday night prayer group during her battle with cancer, and she soon became a friend, and she started praying herself. Ali loved visiting antiques shops, and one day, while she was browsing one, she came across this beautiful old Singer-style sewing machine. The manual kind, mounted on a table with a foot pedal, the kind of thing you would not put in a backyard shed. And when she saw it, she whispered this very simple prayer. She said, God, I'd love something like that for my place. Now, the Bible portrays God as a gift-giving God. He's said to give us food and joy and sunshine and rain. He gives us forgiveness the moment we ask for it. Jesus described God to be like a father, and he compared this father to earthly parents. He said, if we know how to give our children good gifts, even though we're so often flawed and even selfish, well, how much more so if it's perfect God? We can therefore trust him to give us what we need. But there's a big difference between praying for a need and praying for an antique sewing machine. Ali wasn't praying for food, she wasn't praying for safety, she wasn't praying for forgiveness. Her request was a childlike wish to a God she was only just becoming acquainted with. And I'm not even too sure if she was actually serious about her prayer. A couple of days later, Ali was walking out her front door on her way to work when she saw a pile of junk by the roadside. She stopped, stunned. There in the rubbish stood an old Singer-style sewing machine, the manual kind, mounted on the table with a foot pedal, and get this, on it hung a sign that said, perfect condition, please take. Now, there's a mystery to all this, of course. My wife and I prayed for a decade to have a child, and we never got the child. And others have prayed for more desperate needs without an answer. And the mystery was there for Ali too. After all the prayers and after what we thought was a miraculous recovery from her cancer, the cancer won. We lost Ali 8 weeks ago. I don't begin to understand how all of this works. But I do believe each of us gets a moment when God reveals himself personally to us. And Ali's sewing machine experience was her moment. The moment she discovered a God who hears every thought, every wish, and is often found in unexpected places.